In 1973, a reporter gathered descendants of the richest family America had ever produced and asked a simple question: is there a millionaire among you? Not one. Up. 90 years earlier, that family controlled more money than the United States Treasury itself. Now, they were teachers, campers, ordinary people with an extraordinary last name. This is the story of how a fortune, bigger than entire nations, simply vanished. Part 1. The man who built an empire from nothing 015 to 230. Long before the private jets, before the mansions with 100 rooms, there was a boy who never finished school. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, New York, into a family that made a modest living ferrying goods across the harbor. He left the classroom at 11. He never learned to spell properly, and legal documents from later in his life show he barely bothered to try. But numbers and leverage he understood instinctively. At 16, he borrowed money from his mother to buy a small boat. He used it to ferry passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. Within a few years, he wasn't just running a boat. He was undercutting every competitor on the water, slashing fares until rivals went broke, then raising prices once the field was clear. It was a brutal, effective pattern. He would repeat it for the rest of his life. By his 30s, people had already given him a nickname, the Commodore, not because he served in any navy, but because he acted like he owned the sea itself. Here's the twist most people miss. Vanderbilt made his first fortune in shipping, not railroads. He built and controlled steamship lines and down the eastern seaboard, then expanded into transporting prospectors to California during the gold rush, cutting the journey time through Nicaragua and pocketing enormous profits along the way. By the 1860s, in his late 60s, an age when most men of his era were winding down, Vanderbilt did something almost nobody expected. He looked at the still young, chaotic railroad industry and decided the future wasn't on the water. It won the tracks. He sold off his shipping empire and poured everything into railroads, eventually consolidating lines into the New York Central Railroad, one of the most important transportation arteries in the country. He didn't just own trains. He owned the invisible infrastructure that decided which American cities would boom and which would wither. When he died in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt left behind roughly $100 million. To understand what that meant, consider this. At the time, it was more money than the entire United States federal government kept in its treasury. Some later estimates place his fortune, adjusted into modern terms, well above $100 billion. One immigrant's grandson, self-taught, half-literate by his own admission, had built one of the largest personal fortunes the world had ever seen. But here's the question that should already be nagging at you. What happens to an empire like that when the founder, the one man who built it through sheer instinct, is no longer around to run it? Part 2. The peak, a family that literally outspent kings, 230 to 530. Cornelius left almost everything, around 95% of his fortune, to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. It was a calculated bet. Cornelius believed splitting the money among all his children would dilute it into irrelevance. Concentrate it in one capable heir, he reasoned, and the empire survives. For one generation, the bet paid off spectacularly. William Henry didn't just preserve his father's fortune, he doubled it. In under 9 years, he grew the estate from roughly $100 million to an estimated $200 million, largely by continuing to expand the railroad network his father had built. When he died in 1885, he was, briefly, the richest man in the world. Then split. William Henry divided his fortune among his children, and this is where the Vanderbilt story shifts from a business case study into something closer to a fever dream of American excess. His son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, built a summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island called The Breakers, a 70-room limestone palace modeled on Italian Renaissance architecture, complete with imported marble gold leaf ceilings and a kitchen staff larger than most restaurants employ today. Another son, William Kissam Vanderbilt, built a French Renaissance chateau on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan just to force New York's old money elite, who had long looked down on the Vanderbilts as vulgar new money, to finally accept his wife into their social circles. It worked. The Vanderbilts essentially built their way into aristocracy, with architecture as their weapon. And then there was Biltmore. George Washington Vanderbilt II, another grandson of Cornelius, built the largest privately owned house ever constructed in the United States, a 250,000 square foot chateau in Asheville, North Carolina, with 250 rooms, its own farm, dairy and forestry operation covering some 8,000 acres peak, later expanded to over 100,000. It remains the largest home in America to this day. By the late 1800s, the Vanderbilts didn't just have money. They had at least 10 mansions along a single stretch of Fifth Avenue, a fleet of yachts, and a presence in nearly every industry that mattered: railroads, shipping, banking, real estate. Historians estimate that, at the family's peak, combined Vanderbilt wealth may have exceeded $1 billion, at a time when the entire U.S. federal budget was a fraction of that figure. They weren't rich. They were a shadow government of capital. But notice something in everything you just heard. Cornelius built, William Henry expanded, and the grandchildren, they built houses. Part 3. The cracks no one wanted to see. 5:30 to 8:30. Wealth built by one obsessive, disciplined man rarely survives contact with comfort. And comfort was the one thing Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandchildren had in unlimited supply. The first hidden weakness was structural. The fortune kept splitting. Cornelius had one heir. William Henry had 8 children, and he divided his estate among all of them. Each subsequent generation had more descendants, and each division cut the pie into smaller pieces. It's simple arithmetic, but it's brutal when compounded across decades. A fortune that isn't growing faster than it's dividing is, mathematically, already dying. The second weakness was cultural. Cornelius Vanderbilt built his empire through frugality bordering on ruthlessness. He reportedly disliked ostentatious spending and viewed his fortune as something to be reinvested, not displayed. His descendants inherited the fortune, but not the instinct. To them, wealth wasn't a tool for building more wealth. It was a stage for spectacle. Newport cottages, transatlantic yachts, wardrobes replaced by the season, parties that more than most Americans earned in a decade. This wasn't occasional indulgence. It was a lifestyle engineered around display, not preservation. The third weakness was even quieter, and arguably more dangerous. Almost none of the fortune was protected in the way modern dynasties protect theirs. Families like the Rockefellers, who built their wealth slightly later, structured much of it into trusts, legal shields designed to keep capital compounding for generations, insulated from any single heir's bad decisions or bad luck. The Vanderbilts, by contrast, largely inherited outright. Cash and assets landed directly in individual hands, with far fewer guardrails. When a fortune sits in the open like that, every spendthrift heir, every divorce, Every bad investment takes a direct bite out of the family's future. And there's a fourth, more human weakness worth naming plainly. None of the grandchildren possessed Cornelius's specific, almost feral instinct for business. They were educated, cultured, socially skilled. But running railroads in a rapidly industrializing, increasingly competitive America required the same relentless, occasionally ruthless focus their grandfather had. Most of them simply weren't built that way, and understandably so. It's difficult to develop a hunter's instinct when you're born already at the top of the food chain. By the early 1900s, most of these weaknesses were still invisible to outsiders. The mansions kept getting built. The parties kept getting bigger. From the street, the Vanderbilt name still looked untouchable. But underneath the marble floors, the foundation was already cracking, and history was about to hand this family a series of blows it simply wasn't built to absorb. Part 4. The Turning Points, Death, Taxes, and a Changing America 8312. No single event destroyed the Vanderbilt fortune. It eroded, turning point by turning point, decade by decade. The first turning point was the railroad itself losing its crown. For most of the late 1800s, railroads were the single most powerful industry in America, the arteries of the entire economy. But by the early 20th century, automobiles, trucking, and eventually air travel began chipping away at rail's dominance. The very industry that had made the Vanderbilts the richest family on earth was slowly becoming yesterday's technology. And unlike his grandfather, who had the instinct to jump from shipping into railroads at exactly the right moment, most of the Vanderbilt heirs stayed put, comfortable, and increasingly out of step with where the American economy was heading. The second turning point was the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913, followed by steep estate taxes in the decades that followed. For the first time in American history, extreme wealth couldn't simply pass untouched from one generation to the next. Each time a Vanderbilt fortune changed hands, a meaningful percentage was taxed away by the federal government, a mechanism the family's original architecture, built for a tax-free Gilded Age, was never designed to withstand. The third turning point was the Great Depression. Beginning in 1929, the American economy contracted with a violence that spared almost no one, and the Vanderbilts were not immune. Real estate values, which formed a significant part of the family's remaining holdings, collapsed. Maintaining a 70-room cottage or a 250-room chateau suddenly looked less like luxury and more like liability, because unlike stocks or cash, mansions don't shrink when times get hard. Their staffing costs, upkeep, and property taxes stay brutally fixed, even as family income falls. And this is where you start to see the pattern turn from decline into collapse. One by one, the great Vanderbilt houses became too expensive to keep. Many of the Fifth Avenue mansions in Manhattan, palaces that had once defined the skyline of American wealth, were demolished, not preserved, simply because no single family member could justify the cost of maintaining them any longer. Where marble ballrooms once stood, office buildings and apartment towers rose instead. Biltmore, the largest private home in America, became so expensive to maintain that George Vanderbilt's widow eventually had to open sections of the property to paying visitors just to keep the estate financially viable, turning a private palace into what was essentially America's first house museum funded by tourism, decades before it was formally opened to the public. The fourth, and perhaps most overlooked turning point, was simply generational drift. As decades passed, later generations of Vanderbilts increasingly pursued careers in the arts, fashion, journalism, and philanthropy rather than finance or industry. That's not a moral failing. Many built genuinely respected careers on their own merit. But it meant fewer and fewer family members were positioned, or even interested, in actively growing what remained of the original fortune. The engine that built the empire had simply stopped running. By the mid-20th century, something almost unthinkable was happening. The family whose name had once been a synonym for limitless American wealth was quietly becoming ordinary. Part 5. The Vanishing, 1212 to 1530. By 1947, journalist and author Arthur T. Vanderbilt II, a descendant himself, later documented what had become of this fortune in stark terms. When 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion at Vanderbilt University that year, not one of them was a millionaire. Let that sink in for a moment. This was roughly 70 years after Cornelius Vanderbilt died, holding a fortune that dwarfed the U.S. Treasury. 70 years, not 700. Within the span of a single long human lifetime, a wealth empire once compared to nations had dissolved into a large extended family of ordinary professionals. The mansions tell the same story in physical form. The Breakers, once a private summer cottage, is today operated by the Preservation Society of Newport County. The maintains a small ceremonial stake, but effectively the house belongs to the public now, sustained by admission tickets from tourists rather than family wealth. Several of the grand Fifth Avenue mansions were torn down decades ago. Almost none remain standing in their original form. Biltmore, remarkably, is still privately held by descendants of George Vanderbilt, but only because it too was restructured decades ago into a tourism-funded operation, welcoming well over 1 million visitors a year just to remain financially solvent. Here's the deeper mechanism worth understanding, because it explains far more than just one family's story. Wealth built on appreciating productive assets, railroads, shipping lines, factories, businesses that generate ongoing income, can compound and grow across generations. But wealth converted into non-productive, high-maintenance assets, mansions, yachts, staff, spectacle, doesn't compound. It bleeds. Every year a mansion sits there. It costs money in upkeep, staff, insurance, and taxes, without generating a comparable return. Multiply that bleeding across 7 or 8 decades, several generations, and a tax system that takes a cut at every transfer, and the outcome isn't surprising at all. It's almost mathematically inevitable. The Vanderbilts didn't lose their fortune in a single scandal, a single crash, or a single bad decision. There was no dramatic villain, no headline-grabbing fraud. They simply spent faster than they earned, divided faster than they grew, and failed to protect what they had. Generation after generation, small decision after small decision, until one day, the money that once could have bought entire American industries was simply gone. And that raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If this could happen to the richest family in American history, whose fortune was once larger than the U.S. Treasury itself, what does that say about the idea that extreme wealth, once achieved, is safe forever? Part 6. What survived? Legacy without the money, 1530–1800. Here's the part of the story that complicates the simple rags to riches to rags narrative. The Vanderbilt name never actually disappeared. The money did. The legacy didn't. Cornelius Vanderbilt, despite his reputation as a man obsessed with accumulation rather than charity, made one enormously consequential donation late in his life. Roughly $1 million to a struggling university in Nashville, Tennessee, which promptly renamed itself Vanderbilt University in his honor. Today, That institution is one of the most respected research universities in the United States, arguably a more lasting monument to the Commodore than any of the fortune he left behind. The physical mansions that survived, the Breakers, Biltmore, and a handful of others, didn't survive because the family stayed wealthy enough to maintain them. They survived because they were converted into public attractions, museums, and historical landmarks, visited today by millions of tourists who often have no idea how deep the Vanderbilt story actually runs beneath the marble floors they're walking on. And the family itself never vanished. They simply reintegrated into ordinary American life, the way most families eventually do. Perhaps the most well-known modern Vanderbilt descendant is journalist Anderson Cooper, a direct descendant of Cornelius Vanderbilt through his mother, the artist and designer Gloria Vanderbilt. Cooper has spoken publicly more than once about the fact that he never expected and never received any meaningful inheritance connected to the original Vanderbilt fortune. Gloria Vanderbilt herself built and lost several fortunes of her own across her lifetime, entirely independent of the money her ancestors once held. Think about the symbolism there for a moment. The great-great-great-grandson of the man who once controlled more wealth than the federal government built his own career and reputation from scratch as a journalist, earning a living the same way most of his viewers do. That's not a tragedy. In many ways, it's a strange kind of vindication for Cornelius Vanderbilt's original instincts. He always believed hard work and self-made effort mattered more than inherited comfort. He just probably never imagined his own descendants would end up proving that philosophy by losing the very fortune he built. Part 7. Not an isolated story, 1820. Here's what makes the Vanderbilt collapse even more significant. It isn't unique. It's part of a pattern so consistent across history that sociologists and economists actually have a name for it, sometimes called shirt sleeves to three generations. A saying with versions in cultures from the United States to China to Italy, all describing the same phenomenon. First generation builds the fortune, the second generation maintains it, and the third generation loses it. The Astor family, once considered America's wealthiest, saw their real estate empire fragment and diminish across generations in a strikingly similar way. Some studies of wealthy families more broadly have found that a significant majority of family fortunes are substantially diminished or gone entirely by the third generation, and an even larger share by the fourth. Compare that to a family like the Rockefellers, whose fortune, while also reduced in relative terms from John D. Rockefeller's wealth, has remained far more intact across generations, largely because the family aggressively used trusts, professional wealth management, and philanthropic structures like the Rockefeller Foundation to keep capital working and protected, rather than sitting exposed in mansions and personal accounts. The difference wasn't luck, it was structure. One family built systems designed to outlive individual decisions. The other trusted individual heirs to make the right decisions, generation after generation, and eventually, statistically, someone won't. Part 8. The lesson 20:0 to 21:30. If there's one idea worth taking away from the entire Vanderbilt saga, it's this. Building a fortune and preserving a fortune are two completely different skills. And history shows us, again and again, that they rarely live in the same person, let alone the same family line. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a builder. Relentless, frugal, instinctive, willing to put everything on shipping, and then everything again on railroads at exactly the right moments. But building wealth and protecting wealth require almost opposite mindsets. Building rewards risk, aggression, and constant reinvestment. Protecting wealth across generations requires structure, discipline, the humility to build systems that don't depend on any one person's genius, including your own. The Vanderbilts had the first skill in abundance. In exactly one generation, they never developed the second. And perhaps that's the most human part of this entire story. It's not really about villains or geniuses. It's about how easy it is, when you're born into comfort, to mistake spending for living, and how a fortune that took one extraordinary lifetime to build can take 2 or 3 ordinary ones to disappear. Closing, the Callback, 2130 to 2230. Remember that reporter in 1973, standing in a room full of Vanderbilt descendants, asking if a single millionaire remained among them? Not winning up. But somewhere in that room was also proof that the story wasn't entirely a tragedy. Descendants who had built respected careers, raised families, and quietly moved on from a legacy of marble mansions and private railroads into something more ordinary and in its own way, more sustainable. The money Cornelius Vanderbilt built is gone, almost entirely gone, but his name still opens the doors of a major university. His family's houses still stand as museums, visited by millions who never knew a single family once tried to own the entire country's infrastructure from the inside. And his descendants are still out there, not in America's railroads anymore, but writing its news, building their own paths, one ordinary generation at a time. They owned nearly everything in America. Then, slowly, they simply became like everyone else. Next video teaser, 2230 to 2300. But the Vanderbilts weren't the only family that believed their fortune was too big to ever disappear. Decades before the Vanderbilts crumbled, another family had already built and lost an empire even the Vanderbilts once envied, a real estate dynasty that, at its peak, was considered the single wealthiest family in the United States. Their name was on more addresses across New York City than almost anyone else in American history. Their fortune didn't erode over 3 generations. It nearly vanished in one. That's next.